Chapter 38. That evening, they sat together on the bench on his front porch. A blanket covered their laps as they watched the snow fall in the swiftly fading light. "How did it go today?" Steve asked. It was the same question he asked after every appointment, since Jade had told him she didn't need him to go in with her anymore. He didn't ask for details, just how it went. "Good," she said, her eyes still on the falling snow. "It went really well." She was silent for several minutes. "I think it's time." Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. Something in her tone caught his attention, and he looked down at her. "Time for what?" "Time to try sex on my terms." She used the same soft voice, but there was something strong and certain in her tone. "Are you sure?" She took a deep breath and looked at him for the first time since bringing it up. "I'm terrified, but I know you won't hurt me. You'll do everything you can to keep from scaring me more." She laid one hand against his cheek. "I need to do this. It's time." He looked down at her, uncertainty filling his eyes. He knew. "Let's go inside where it's warm and we can get comfortable." He stood, and before she had a chance to do the same, he scooped her up, blanket and all, and carried her inside. Once he kicked the door closed, set her on her feet and helped her take off her coat, then added wood to the stove to take the chill from the air. "Come here," he called from the living room. "Yes?" she asked, reaching his side. "Before we go any further, I want to get some things straight." He looked down at where she stood in front of him, then sat on the sofa. "Okay." She sat a couple of feet away on the arm of the recliner. She was too far away to suit him, but it was probably better this way, at least for now. "First, you're in charge. I don't want to scare you or hurt you in any way, so if you tell me to stop, I stop. Instantly." He kept his tone gentle but firm. He watched for her response, and at her nod, he continued, "Second, you're in the lead. If at any time I touch you in any way or do anything that makes you uncomfortable, say so. We'll figure out how to make it work for you. Do you understand?" "I understand." She gave him one swift nod. "Can I touch you now?" He spread his arms wide. "I'm all yours." He waited, holding his breath, not sure she was really ready for this. She moved to the couch and went to her hands and knees to close the gap between them. "I've been dying to do this for days." She tugged his sweater over his head, taking his t-shirt with it, then sat on her heels and just looked at him. "How did I miss this before?" She ran the fingers of one hand lightly over the tattoo, high on the left side of his chest. She marveled at the slightly different texture of the colored skin. "I'm not sure you've seen me without a shirt since I was a teenager." He watched her reaction, a small smile on his mouth. "How long have you had it?" Her fingers outlined the snarling cougar, staring out at her with odd-colored eyes. "I got her not long after boot camp." "No one asked why a cougar." "A couple, I just told them the truth. She reminded me of a girl back home. Pretty but dangerous." Her eyes finally left the amazing artwork and found their way to his face. She stared at him a moment, confused. "Look at her eyes, Jade." His voice stayed calm and patient, the way it did when he was waiting for her to see something obvious. "I noticed. They're an odd pale green. That's not the color of a cougar's eyes." Her brow creased, and she looked back at the cat, as if trying to figure out what he was telling her. "Babe." His breath fanned against her cheek as he ran the back of one finger down her neck. "Her eyes are jade." Her mouth fell open, and she looked him in the eye again. Blinking, looked at him, her mouth moving but no sound came out. Steve started chuckling, his body vibrating beneath the fingers still resting on his chest. "Never thought I'd see you speechless, baby. Or that I'd be the one to put you in such a state." He hugged her close for a moment. When she could speak again, she couldn't help but ask, "You got this done when you were 18? "Most of it," he said. "I've had some touch-up work done." Her eyes changed, but that's about it. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Her eyes changed? He nodded. They started out the golden yellow of a natural cougar. But I had them changed almost 10 years ago. Why? I'd dreamed about her for a long time, but I never got a good look at her eyes. Then I got out of the Marines, went home and saw you. The pull between us had changed, and I knew she was you. I had her eyes changed after that. She was quiet for a moment. Has Matt seen it? Steve nodded. Once, a few years ago. We'd gotten together for a few days, and ended up at a hotel pool. We fought that day, probably the worst fight we've ever had. We both walked away bruised and bloody, but we'd worked it out. She frowned. Why did you fight? It's just a cougar. He knew the instant he saw her eyes that she's you, baby. He didn't like it. But how can she be me? Her eyes flicked to his face, then back to the cat. I hadn't even shifted yet, I didn't have a cat then. But you would, I had no doubt. She's fierce and yet beautiful, just like you. That's so sweet. He ran one knuckle down the side of her face again. It's the truth. She looked away a moment, and when she looked back, her whole demeanor changed. She seemed more confident, less frightened. She ran her hands over his chest. You're so warm, she mumbled, leaning into his mouth with hers. She coaxed his mouth open and drew him into a deeper kiss. He lifted his hands to rest on her hips, and she shivered when he let one slip under her sweater and slide along the bare skin of her back. You all right? He broke the kiss to ask. She nodded and went back into kissing him without a word. At the same time, she ran her hands over his chest and shoulders. His hands moved, one cupped her ass through her jeans, the other splayed against her bare back, but he went no further. After several minutes, she broke away. I need more. Her voice had turned breathy. She pulled her sweater and t-shirt over her head and tossed them aside. I want to feel your skin touching mine. This might be a little easier on the bed. His voice was thick but not as breathy as hers as he asked if they could move. She nodded as she lowered her mouth to his neck. Without another word, he pulled her against him and stood, trying to keep her from feeling how hard he was through his jeans as he carried her into the bedroom. He set her on the bed, then let her go and lay on his back. Do your worst. She looked at him from head to toe, spread out like a banquet, just for her. Can I lick you here? She touched one nipple. He'd thought it was impossible, but his jeans got tighter. You can do anything you want. She met his eyes, uncertain. You're sure? Positive. She grinned, then bent over him and kissed him again, briefly this time, before moving her mouth away. Trailing it down the side of his neck, she drew swirling designs along his chest with her tongue until she found one nipple. He jumped and tried not to hiss as she drew the tiny button into the heat of her mouth. Every pull, as she sucked on the sensitive spot, sent bolts of sensation to his cock. He groaned. A long deep sound that he couldn't hold in. Did I hurt you? She asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Anne, he had to swallow to get the words out. No, it feels good, really good. He put his hands on her hips and pulled her up his body. Come here and let me show you. I don't know. She seemed uncertain. I do. It won't hurt, trust me. He leaned up and moved her so they were face to face and kissed her, a quick hard kiss that he poured all his longing into. Come on, put one leg on either side of me. He dropped back to the bed and guided her until she knelt astride his chest. Perfect. Sliding his hands up her body, he cupped her breasts through the bra she still wore. Perfect, he said again, loving how they just filled his hands. He gently squeezed and kneaded the soft mounds of flesh, then tugged one cup down to reveal the nipple. He flicked one finger back and forth over the sensitive tip, until it drew into a tight bud. You like that? It feels odd but good. Can I take this off? He ran one finger under the band around her chest. Instead of answering, she reached back and unhooked the bra with a deft flip of her fingers. With gentle hands, he slipped the straps from her shoulders and lowered the cups away from her breasts. Beautiful. He tossed the bra aside. Bringing both hands up, he cupped both breasts gently, then rolled one nipple between his thumb and forefinger. Lean down here. He lifted his head to meet her halfway. She tensed when he pulled the tender tip into his mouth, sucking hard for several seconds before playing his tongue over the sensitized skin. He bit gently, then sucked the sting out, and she moaned softly. He moved his hand to cover the other breast and mirrored the actions of his mouth. Then he switched breasts and gave the other the same attention. The longer he kept it up, the more intense his touch got. His bite a little harder, his grip a little tighter. Jade's moans grew longer, deeper, and she moved against him. When her hips started grinding into his chest, he thought he would burst the zipper in his jeans. He moved his mouth down her stomach and found Jade breathing heavy. I want you on your back, can you handle that? I think so. She moved off him and lay back, watching his every move. He bent over her and put his mouth back to her belly where he'd left off. He worked a trail down her stomach and made swirls with his tongue along the waistband of her jeans. Her hips strained against him. I want to take these off. She nodded and reached for the button. No. Let me. He slowly slipped the button loose and lowered the tab on her zipper, still teasing her stomach with his tongue and the rough growth of his beard. Lift your hips, baby. She braced her feet against the mattress and did as he asked. He slid her jeans off her hips and down her thighs. You're good. He watched as she lowered herself against the bed, then finished pulling off her pants and tossing them aside. He lowered his mouth to the waistband of her tiny lace panties, making teasing swirls from one hip bone to the other, then pulling away. He ran gentle hands up her thighs until his thumbs met at the apex. He slipped a single finger between her closed thighs. Through the thin panties, he spread her nether lips and ran a light touch over the hard, sensitive nub hiding inside. Jade gasped and her entire body jerked. Like that, sweetheart? He watched her face for any sign of distress. He could smell her arousal, but that didn't mean she wasn't afraid, even if he wasn't scenting fear. Feels good, she said, easing her thighs apart a little. Want more? Please? She breathed. He hesitated. Just remember, all you have to say is stop and I will. All right? She nodded, meeting his eyes. Can I take these off? He ran his fingers under the elastic of one leg of her panties. Instead of bothering with words, she lifted her hips. He slowly tugged the satin and lace off her hips, teasing her skin with his mouth along the way, light nips with his teeth, then kissing away the sting. Once he tossed the slight garment aside, he sat a moment, just looking at her. You're beautiful. He ran a light touch down the side of one breast, smoothing his fingertips along the dip of her waist, then his hand come to rest on her hip. He watched her a moment longer, then lowered his mouth to her breast, teasing the tip back to a hard, tight bud before moving to the other side and treating that nipple the same. Jade whimpered beneath him and her hips moved, restless against the bed. You doing okay, baby? He watched her face, looking for signs of fear or distress. It aches, she said with a moan. Is it a good ache or a bad ache, baby? She whimpered again. A good one. Her hips moved again. I don't know what to do. That's easy, sweetheart. Stay there and enjoy. He lowered his mouth once more, teasing her breasts in turn before he started moving down her body again. He kissed his way down her stomach and noticed for the first time that she kept the hair between her thighs trimmed short. He kissed lower, easing her thighs apart with careful hands as he lowered his face to her center. He inhaled softly, taking in the scent of her arousal and wondering what she'd taste like when she exploded against his mouth. Steve ran the flat of his tongue up the length of her slit, spreading her and tasting the moisture flowing from her core. She jerked and looked down her body at him. "Steve?" Her voice shook with uncertainty. "What is it? Are you sure you should be?" She trailed off, unable to finish. He tilted his head to one side, like a curious cat. "Did you like it?" "Well, yeah." Her face turned pink. "Then why not?" "Well, I like the way you taste, baby. Like sweet cream mixed with honey." He watched her a moment longer. "Lay back and enjoy, okay?" "Oh, all right." She did as he asked but didn't entirely relax. "Tell me if I hurt you, but try to focus on how it feels, okay?" Steve knew that despite what she'd been through, in many ways she was still a virgin. He knew he needed to be patient, but it wasn't easy. He adjusted himself inside his jeans, then leaned back down. "I'll tell you what, give me your hands." She gave them without argument. He put her hands on his shoulders. "Keep your hands on me, my shoulders, my head, even tangled in my hair. That way if you don't like anything I do, you can pull me away, all right?" "All right," she repeated, more confident. He lowered his mouth to her once more, and ran his tongue around the edge of her opening, tasting the sweet cream, before pushing it as far as he could reach inside. Jade's fingers curled in his hair, not pulling him away but holding on. He licked and kissed her core, dragging out as much of the sweet moisture as he could. He moved upward, running the tip of his tongue around the hard bundle of nerves that sat exposed. He slid one finger carefully around her opening, moistening the tip as he flicked his tongue over her clit. The fingers in his hair tightened. They pulled him closer, as if she was unwilling to let him stop. He sucked hard on the small nub as he slowly pressed one finger into her, easing out and back in, letting the slick fluid flowing from her ease the way. "Steve?" Her voice was threaded with fear, but her grip didn't relax. She still pulled him into her, not away. "It's okay, baby, I know it's a little scary the first time. Trust me. Let it come." He sucked harder on her clit, flicking his tongue back and forth over the tip while working his finger in and out of her. Her hands in his hair tightened until he thought she might pull his hair out. Without realizing what he was doing, he purred. A deep rumble that started in his chest and echoed up his throat and mouth, vibrating through her. She screamed his name and her cunt clamped around his finger as she came. He lapped at her center, drinking the sweet honey leaking from her as she relaxed her grip on his hair and went limp against the bed. "What was that?" she asked once she could speak again. "That, sweetheart, was an orgasm." He moved up and lay beside her. She gave him a lazy smile. "I like that." "I thought you might." He grinned back. "I didn't know you could do that." She rolled onto her side and curled against him. "Do what? Make you feel like that?" He wrapped his arm around her and held her close. "That too, but I mean what you did with your mouth." "Sweetheart, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We could go on for months, pleasing each other in different ways, and finding our favorites." Her expression turned sad. "But we still have to get past one thing first." "What's that?" he asked. "My first time, I mean, except for," she trailed off. He rolled to his side and gave her a soft kiss on the lips. "Baby, I thought you did great for a first time, especially with everything you've been through." "But that wasn't sex." Her face turned red. "It was great, but..." Steve chuckled. "It's called oral sex for a reason. You know what I mean." Her embarrassment faded as she argued. I do, baby, but we don't have to do more if you don't want to. I want to. I want to be able to put it behind me. She pushed against his chest and he rolled to his back, giving her the space she wanted. I just don't know if I can handle it, that feeling of being trapped. You mean on your back? Yeah. She lost her relaxed manner. Like then. Sweetheart, that's one position. We can go a lifetime and never do that, if it bothers you. We can? She sounded unconvinced. Come here. He tugged on her arm until she sat beside his reclined body. You sure you want to do this? Certain. She gave him a decisive nod. You want to help me with my jeans, or do you want me to take them off? Can you do it? She bit her lower lip. But leave your shorts on, please. No problem. He quickly shed his jeans and lay on the bed where he'd started. He folded his hands behind his head and looked up at her. What do you want now? Can I touch you? Like you touched me? You mean when I put my mouth on you? She looked at him, hesitated, then nodded. Normally, I'd love to have you use your pretty little mouth on me, but right now I'm not sure of my control. If you put your mouth on my cock right now, I'd come so fast I'd shame myself. She turned bright red. But if you'll hold off on that, I'll do my best to make you come again, when the time comes. He pulled one hand from behind his head to run the backs of his fingers down her cheek and along her jaw. She slid one tentative hand across his chest, stopping to flick her thumb over one nipple. He groaned and arched his back, lifting his body into her hand. You like that? She asked. Did you? He countered. If you liked it, chances are I will too. The idea seemed to boost her confidence. She lowered her mouth to his chest, taking one small nipple into her mouth. She sucked on it a moment before teasing it with her tongue. Bite it, not hard, just a little nip, he encouraged. He drew a sharp breath when she did it and whimpered. Just like that. That feels good, Jade. More sure of herself, she slid her hands down his chest to his hips and fiddled with the waistband of his shorts for a moment before sliding past it. She ran her hands over the soft cotton of his briefs, finding his thick erection. She wrapped her hand around his cock and squeezed through the fabric. He groaned and fought the urge to pump his hips against her. He pulled her hand away. I'm too close, baby. Another time. How do we do this? She asked, the uncertainty back in her voice. Are you ready? He looked at her. She met his eye. I think so. I'm all hot and tingly all over. Hang on a sec. He rolled until he could reach the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a condom. Here. He handed her the foil packet, then rolled back and slid his shorts off, kicking them aside. She looked at the condom in her hand. I didn't even think about this. It's okay, Jade, I did. He took the small square from her and ripped it open, unrolling the condom over himself. Come here. He curled his finger. One leg on either side, like earlier. He helped her into position, lining himself up with her opening. Now it's up to you. You can go as fast or as slow as you like. I'm not sure I know how to do this. She looked at him, a worried frown on her pretty face. Of course you do, follow your instincts. He slid his hands up her sides until he was cupping her breasts. Flicking his thumbs over the tips, he teased them until they drew into tight beads. He squeezed the globes, kneading the soft flesh while he leaned up and flicked his tongue over the tight tips in turn. Jade groaned at the sensations and her legs relaxed under her, letting her body slide down onto his. Her eyes widened and she froze. See, you're hot and wet and you slide easily on my cock. I wish you'd go a little farther though. She relaxed a little and sank lower onto his manhood. God, you feel good. He dropped his head back and groaned at the tight heat surrounding him. I don't know how. Her voice shook and he knew she was scared. He moved his hands to her hip. Sure you do, lift up a little, he guided her as she rose on her knees, then relax. Let your weight do the work for you. He groaned as she did exactly as he said, and sank all the way onto his cock, her pelvis resting against his. He was completely buried inside her. He didn't have to urge her to do it again. She slid up then settled back over him, setting a slow, torturing pace. He moved his hands back up to cup her breasts, flicking the tips before lightly squeezing. He knew it would inflame her senses and make her desperate for more. She began to move faster up and down, and her breath came in short gasps. Steve, she cried. Help me. Hang on, stop moving for a second. He waited until she came to a stop, her pelvis against his. Her cunt started to clench around him, she was close but not quite there. Try this. He shifted her legs so she had her feet on either side of him, her knees in the air. Now try. She moved. Her eyes widened at the change in sensation from the different angle, and in just a few strokes, Steve felt her tightening around him again. He slipped one hand between them and used his thumb to press against her clit. She screamed and her body seized, tightening around him until he couldn't hold on to his control any longer either. He came with a shout. He caught her as she collapsed against him, his penis still buried inside her. When they both could breathe normally again, he rolled them both to one side. He went into the bathroom to dispose of the condom and clean up. Taking a wet cloth back to the bed, he cleaned her up before tucking her into bed. He was tugging on his sweatpants when she stopped him. What are you doing? Her voice thick with satisfaction. Putting on my pants. Why? Because I always wear them when you're in bed with me. Do you sleep in them when I'm not here? No. He frowned. Then why bother? It seems silly now that we've, you know. You sure? He asked. I'm sure. Now come here. He tossed the pants aside and climbed between the sheets, sliding over to pull her against him.